All right, I've just fired up Mafia the Old Country, and what sort of system did I build for this video to start out with? Well, I was looking at the system requirements, and these do look pretty heavy, so I wanted to build something close to the recommended requirements, at least to begin with, and kind of go from there. Now, I don't actually have a 3080 Ti or a 6950 XT. I do have a 3080 12GB though. The standard 3080 was a 10GB card, and the 3080 12GB kind of splits the difference. It matches the 3080 Ti's VRAM capacity and is a little more performant than the base 3080 as well, but performance overall is a few percent slower than the 3080 Ti. So it's extremely close to a 3080 Ti, but not quite there, but has the same video memory, which notice they are specifying they recommend 12 gigabytes for the recommended specs. They're also saying that this should be for 1440p high preset with upscaling set to quality. So we will be playing around with graphic settings as well, but they never said what sort of frame rate to expect when doing this. Also, for CPUs, I don't have a 5800X, but I do have from that generation a 5600X, which is 6-core 12-thread. The 5800X would have been 8-core 16-thread with a little bit higher clock speeds. I do have 32 gigabytes of RAM in this system. So anyway, overall, we're going to start out with a system that is just, well, let's call it a little bit below the recommended specs for the game, but not wildly below the recommended specs for the game. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at the menus and all that. We are at 1440p. Looks like the cinematic frame rate defaults to a 30 FPS limit. Let's go ahead and set it to unlimited so we can kind of see the performance in the cinematics as well. Gameplay also set to unlimited. And it says quality preset auto detected, and it looks like it went down to mostly high and epic for the auto detect. However, I think what we're gonna do is just go to the high preset, since that is kind of what the recommended specs based on. So it does look to be below what it defaulted to. Still looks like it left textures at epic. And it does default to using Unreal's TSR upscaling. Now, given that we're on an RTX GPU here, DLSS does tend to look better, so we'll set that to DLSS Quality, at least to begin with. So this is going to be pretty close to what the recommended system requirements went for. So let's get some performance numbers going. I'm gonna go ahead and hit the frame rate averages now. Which you can see as the middle FPS number. That's the cumulative average. The third FPS result you see to the right is the 1% lows, and the one on the left is the current FPS average. I'm also showing all the CPU usage, since this game did have fairly beefy CPU requirements. All right, it is now the year 1904, and our frame rates are over 100 FPS, or around 100 FPS, but not a whole lot happening so far. Now, I might edit out bits of the video if there's not a whole lot going on as I kind of play the beginning of the game on this system and see what we think. Okay, I mean, performance is absolutely solid so far, but, you know, we obviously can't see a whole lot going on here. We're in super confined environments. Small frame time blips in the transition into the cutscene. Cutscenes do seem to be running well over 30 FPS, so not sure why we needed the 30 FPS limit by default. Again, maybe that would smooth out some of these frame time blips, maybe not though. It seems like every camera transition during the cutscene, there's a bit of a frame time blip. I'm not really noticing other than looking at the frame time graph though, since this isn't gameplay, so not really too worried about that. Are getting more characters on screen, but still confined area. Performance still seems pretty solid. Definitely a little frame time blip there as we transitioned into movement again. So curious if that's a shader compilation stutter. This is my first time through the game. I have not played this yet, so shader cache is fresh. Okay, looks like we might get some view of the outside. Let's see what happens to performance. Okay, certainly lower now. Actually, I'm so much lower that I'm going to reset the frame rate averages. So we were averaging 80 FPS so far through that initial gameplay sequence in the caves. Now that we are outside, resetting the frame rate averages, we see that we're at about 60 frames per second with 1% lows certainly dipping below that. So we've got a number of characters on screen. I'm out of the mission area apparently, so this is quite an on-the-rails experience so far. Now that's a bad thing. Sometimes I prefer games that aren't super open and just tell me a good story that I can play through in a reasonable amount of time. Let's set down the thing. Okay, one thing I want to point out here is I think we're actually CPU limited right now. So I'm looking a little closer at the performance stats in the top left corner, and if you see the GPU usage percentage, we can see that it's in kind of the mid 80s. And if you actually look at the CPU cores, you can see that they're pretty much all being heavily utilized. Now, none of them read 100%. I know some people have trouble identifying a CPU limit or a GPU limit in game performance. So generally, if you're not running a frame rate cap of some kind, you're letting the game run unrestricted, then the GPU will usually be able to use in the upper 90% range unless something else in the system is holding it back. Usually if something else in the system is holding it back, it is the CPU. So what I'm actually seeing here indicates to me a CPU limit where the CPU is getting hammered hard and the GPU is unable to actually be fully utilized here. Now, why do I think that's happening in this section? Well, there's a lot of characters here. Now, I don't know how much each character here is having to do on the CPU side of things, but this can be, in many games, a very demanding thing on CPUs, is having a lot of characters on screen. And I'm wondering if that's going to kind of continue further in. Now, overall frame rates were still over 60 for the most part, but okay, we're getting a longer view distance and everything. And look, as we're out here looking over this, notice that my CPU utilization is much lower and my GPU utilization is much higher. So it's now looking like we're more back to being GPU limited. And again, if I reset the frame rate averages, it looks like we're now in kind of the mid 80 FPS range. So this game, the system requirements, again, did list some pretty heavy duty CPUs. And it's looking like in more crowd-dense environments, like me going back into this area, frame rate is lower and so is GPU usage. And I don't think that is a complete coincidence, right? Like looking this direction, again, looking like it's mostly a CPU-limited situation on this 3080 with the Ryzen 5 5600X. So again, still over 60 FPS, although not the 1% lows. So not perfect frame time or anything. Now, I wasn't paying any attention to what I'm doing, but it looks like I should probably be heading down this direction. I'm trying to find out if there's a sprint button. I'm pushing all the buttons. We'll try shift on the keyboard. Nope. Okay, so it's looking like we were just going to be in a slow walking situation, which is, fine. We're getting the experience of the world we're in situation, all of that. Looks like we got a little thing here. Okay, had a little bit of a frame time blip as we entered this area. That could be a traversal stutter as you're kind of loading in the additional elements as we get into this zone.
Head to the building at the back.
Again, exiting the cutscene, there was a big frame time blip again. Was noticeable. I'm supposed to be sneaking. All right, I've decided to switch over some hardware to test now. I wanted to switch to a lower end GPU. The minimum requirements are an RTX 2070 or Radeon RX 5700 XT. I don't own either of these currently. However, I do have an RTX 3060, which is just slightly more powerful than a 2070 in raw performance, although it does have 12 gigabytes of VRAM as opposed to 8. But the raw performance is similar to this minimum spec requirement. And actually, rather than going to a weaker CPU, we've already established that even a Ryzen 5 5600X can hit some CPU limitations. I actually want to focus in on GPU performance now, so the best way to do that is to actually remove the CPU limitation so that we can truly see the performance of the graphics card specifically. So I'm actually moving up to a 9800X 3D, which is above the maximum CPU requirements, because it's basically the highest end gaming CPU you can get. We're going to start out at the recommended settings for the minimum GPU though, which was 1080p at DLSS Balanced, or Balanced Level Upscaling. Now this says Quality Custom because I changed the upscaler, but it is the Medium preset. So let's go ahead and load into the game on these settings and see how we do. All right, let's kind of pick up where we left off with gameplay so we can, this isn't like an apples to apples comparison of GPUs against each other, so we're not looking for identical gameplay. It's more playing through a bit of the game to get an idea of how it performs on various systems. That's more what we're looking for here. Looking like at these settings, we are over 70 FPS. Of course, only doing some interior area right now. Looks like we need to get a lock pick or a knife or something here. All right, so we are back outside now. Again, looking like mid 70 FPS range at these settings. All right, it's letting me sprint now, good. We're in the tunnels again, so nothing too crazy performance-wise, but started getting some fire flashing on screen and stuff, so thought I'd kick the recording back on. And that kind of looks like mid-70s. Again, we're still using balance level upscaling at only medium settings, though, for the 1080p output, so seems, performance seems okay overall, but again, using a lot of upscaling to get there. All right, got our first combat sequence, so let's try that out. Looks like we get a knife fight. Overall performance doesn't seem to be dramatically different than what we've seen elsewise. I should probably pay attention to what I'm doing here. So Y to thrust, B to slash. Okay. And A to dodge attacks. And I should probably actually pay attention to the timing then, eh? There we go. But yeah, overall combat performance seems to be mid-70s, does dip into the low 70 range. Looks like we're gonna get a horse, so let's see if that does anything to performance overall here. Again, we're still at those balanced upscaling medium preset 1080p output settings overall. Horse ride didn't seem to be dramatically different in performance or anything. It looks like we're cutting to pre-rendered cutscene. All right, we're into the actual chapter 1 now. Performance does seem a bit different. Also, we now have the instinct where you can kind of see enemy outlines through walls, etc. I noticed that when using that, my frame rate is tanking a bit under 60 FPS. Let's actually do a frame rate average here now. But when not using that in the same scene, frame rates are higher, more like upper 60s or 70s or so. And that is repeatable. Again, every time I do that, frame rate does go down a bit. So yeah, it certainly looks like performance is going to vary a bit based on what we were doing. Now, in that intro section, I had thought that maybe we would turn settings actually less aggressive on upscaling and things like that, since we were averaging more like over 70 FPS. But it seems like now that we're in this area, performance does seem lower. We're hanging out over 60 FPS average, but it is dipping below it at times. Am I trying to escape or am I trying to kill that guy? I wasn't paying attention. Probably supposed to take him out. But yeah, 1% lows are around 50 FPS. I guess we will go the non-lethal, assuming choking was non-lethal. I don't know. Well, it says body. I don't know. I attempted to not go the knife route, but I have no idea if this is a game where whether or not you actually kill them or not matters. Okay, press B to draw the knife. Can I break the lock, perhaps? Sharpen the knife. Okay. Now we can break the lock. What if we do push settings a little bit higher? So I know that that will be then going above the recommended settings for the game. But let's actually do that. So one thing I might want to do is back off the DLSS a bit. So let's go to quality instead of balanced, which for the 1080p output, I think I would prefer. See how that holds up. And then we can also try out maybe increasing graphic settings. Now we're certainly having less headroom above 60 now. Like here we can tell we're kind of in the mid 50s at times. If they split directions, what do I do? Is there a way through that way? Do I have to take them out? Oh wait, there we go. Just have to wait for them to stop talking. So many stealth games, like a huge part of your job is listening to enemies talk until one of them walks away. Yeah, looking like at least in this scene, we're around 60 FPS if we use the DLSS Quality. Now, the next thing I want to try out is what if we actually tried playing at just native resolution 1080p? You know, these are only medium settings. So what if we switch over to, let's see, what options do we have? So it looks like it's just XeSS, FSR, DLSS, or TSR. So the closest thing we would have to like a native anti-aliasing seems like it would be the TSR, which is kind of like TAA, but a little more advanced. So this will be the native resolution 1080p. Let's reset the frame rate counters. Yeah, we're only in the 40s or so. Now that's showing about 43, 44. I am curious if I go ahead and switch over to DLAA, which would have generally better image quality, what that would get us. So DLAA, wow, if anything, that's slightly faster. We're at 46. Interesting. Actually, I almost want to double check I clicked the right settings. But yeah, so it looks like native AA is at kind of mid-40s. So we're trying native resolution 1080p on the RTX 3060. And it does seem pretty difficult to run. We are only in the 40s. So yeah, looks like the upscaling recommended in the system requirements, they were certainly not joking about that. One thing I'm noticing running this more extended cutscene is that, I don't know if I can pause this, don't want spoilers. Anyway, the VRAM allocation is going a little over 8 gigabytes. So this is only medium settings, although it is native resolution. So I think another reason, in addition to performance, that the minimum recommended specs may have been talking about using DLSS Balanced, in addition to only being on the medium preset at 1080p, could have actually been VRAM related, because the longer I play here, the more it goes through cutscenes, VRAM usage is going up. Now it is, I guess, allocation rather than the per process usage showing over 8, but I have seen some games start to have performance implications if the game wants to allocate more than 8 and you only have 8. So that's certainly something to take note of. On a little bit of a horseback ride here now, getting around 50-ish frames per second if I reset it. So that night scene certainly did seem to be maybe more demanding than some of the just kind of going around in the open, which is interesting. This is still the native DLAA. Ooh, I can see, can I not actually walk backwards? You can see the difference in the shadows. So that's one thing about being on lower settings, is stuff like that can be a little bit distracting. Do you see how these shadows kind of draw in more detail as we get closer? Wow, is my horse caught on something there? There we go, okay. Anyway, in kind of a straight line based on distance. So that can be a little bit distracting. Now, let's go ahead and also try out some other graphic settings. So let's try out, what if we actually were attempting to run the maximum settings, but we'll do it with, obviously the performance already wasn't great. So let's go to DLSS Quality, but at otherwise Epic preset. I have a feeling this is going to be a bit rough, but let's see how it goes. So yeah, it looks like we're kind of down into the about 40 FPS range. And remember that this scene was less demanding than what we saw in some other areas. But do notice that things like those shadows now, you know, you're not getting that distracting line as it draws in more detail as you go. Again, this is already using DLSS Quality, and we're only at around this 40-ish FPS. Thought I'd switch back to the medium settings here with the DLSS Balanced, kind of the recommended settings, now that we're into this new area. And yeah, I mean, you're able to be over 60 FPS here. The medium settings look okay with some obvious downgrades from the higher settings. But yeah, it's looking like this game is very heavy. And if you turn the settings up very high, things get even worse, but it does seem adjustable, at least as long as you're willing to use the resolution scaling pretty heavily, to where you can absolutely play the game. But yeah, if we go to something like the Epic settings here, I have a feeling that in this area it's going to be really demanding. So let's take a look. So if I wanted to be at native DLAA, epic settings, even just at 1080p, in an area like this, yeah, we are well under 30 frames per second. So this game certainly scales. Also, look at the VRAM usage is up near 10 gigabytes now. And again, this is only, the allocations near 10 gigabytes, the per process usage about 8. And again, this is at 1080p. I do want to check out some other graphics cards while we're at it. So this is the RTX 3060. Let's try one of the newer AMD GPUs because I heard that this game did launch with FSR 4 support. All right, I've now moved over to the maximum requirements, so the Epic preset requirements, which recommends an AMD RX 9070. I chose to switch over to that to get an AMD GPU with FSR 4 support to test for that, as well as, again, it is just on the recommended list for the Epic preset. Now, I have some questions here, because they say it's 4K Epic preset, but then also state that that's at 75% resolution scaling, which is 2880 by 1620, but then also with quality level upscaling. So it almost seems like rendering below the actual 4K monitor res and then upscaling within that, but at the Epic preset seems to be what they're recommending here. Again, a reminder that I'm on the 9800X3D CPU, so that is actually above even these recommendations. But let's go ahead and jump in. The first thing to note is that the game does indeed have FSR 4 support. The driver toggle is available and confirms that it's working. Now, the initial settings that I'm taking a look at here are showing the full native 4K resolution along with quality level FSR 4. Now, the quality preset itself that I had selected is Epic. It's just maxing out everything across the board. But again, it says custom because I've adjusted it to FSR 4 quality. So in other words, we're starting out with assuming it's 4K native, but like output, but with quality level FSR 4, so not actually native, but without also adjusting the resolution slider right here in the game. Let's see how this goes. So we're into this area of the game. Let's go ahead and start some frame rate counters. Looks like standing here motionless, we're just under 60 frames per second at these settings. Again, this is completely maxed out 4K other than FSR 4 quality. FSR 4 is looking good here, in my opinion. Now, again, depending on what you're doing, frame rates can change. So yeah, it's looking like this is dropping down into the mid 40s now as we're riding the horse across this area. And I think as we get into the next section, things get even more demanding as we get into an actual little town here. Yeah, performance already 1% lows in kind of the mid 30s. So as we get into town here, let's check back in. You can see as we're pulling up on the estate here, we're at closer to 30, mid 30 frames per second range. So certainly more demanding. So yeah, the GPU load can, change a lot depending on what exactly you're doing in the game. And right here, even dipping into the 20s. So yeah, it certainly seems like quality level upscaling for the Epic preset out of 4K output is absolutely not 60 FPS. Now, these system requirements never specifically stated that those would hit 60 FPS, but yeah. Anyway, so if I come out here, let's get to one of those more demanding scenes. I think here with all the foliage, like in a lot of games, foliage can be pretty demanding. Looking out this way, when I'm standing still, frame rates can kind of settle in a bit. But yeah, like right here, we're kind of 37 FPS. That seems to be pretty demanding. And apparently I failed the mission because I'm standing here. Okay, so yeah, this is certainly on the rails so far for the intro. But again, oftentimes I enjoy a more on the rails experience if it's telling me a good story I can play through. But apparently I'm gonna have to repeat this sequence for a second. So how about as we repeat this area, we actually try it out at what I think the system requirements we're talking about, which is setting a 75% of a 4K monitor render resolution and using quality level upscaling on top of that. So really you're playing at 1620p with quality level upscaling, so really barely above a 1440p with quality level upscaling. I have a feeling this is more of what they were talking about with that. So let's reset the frame rate targets and see what happens as we go in here. So now we are certainly closer, you know, we're kind of in the 60 FPS range, but again, I expect this to dip as we pull up on the estate, so we'll have to see. Yeah, so as we're pulling into this area, certainly more like, you know, 50-ish FPS in the more demanding areas, even dropping down into the mid-40s. So yeah, even it looks like the recommended, you know, Epic setting system requirements, even using the 75% render resolution plus the quality level upscaling, isn't quite getting us where I'd like to be. Now, I have a feeling that if I went more aggressive on FSR, it might be a more effective way to go. Although I'd like to go back to, like, what if I'm actually on a 4K display? I'd rather rely, I think, more heavily on the FSR 4 upscaling rather than just decreasing the output resolution of the game. So let's go with FSR performance mode here on the 4K full, you know, trying to reconstruct to a full 4K rather than below that. And okay, still not quite 60 FPS. We're kind of the mid-50s now. So looking back that way, yeah, still kind of in the 50s, low 50s, upper 40s. So yeah, it looks like maxing this game out, other than you know, performance mode upscaling, not quite going to be a 60 FPS on the 9070. And to be clear, again, this is the 9070 non-XT, because that was what was in the system requirements. But yeah, it seemed odd to me that how they stated that in the system requirements with everything. But anyway, all right. I think that that's all the time I have for testing, because I've also been testing out a bunch of Battlefield 6. I will say that this game does indeed look demanding. You can see, you know, even in VRAM right here, we're around 12 gigabytes of allocation and about 10 of per process usage. Only in kind of the mid-40s performance-wise. Yeah, let's see if we can check out, if you were on a 1440p display, though, about how this would be before we go, because I think that does make sense to do. So 1440p, let's go back to like DLSS quality, sorry, FSR 4 quality. Looks like we're kind of in the 50s with all this foliage around, which is pretty demanding. And we'll go ahead and switch over to, what if we went to balanced level FSR, which at 1440p is about as aggressive as I like to go. I'd rather not go to performance mode. Yeah, kind of near 60. So yeah, it's just looking like maxing this game out is going to be pretty demanding. Of course, though, I think the high settings are a lot more optimized than the max settings, which tends to be the case in most Unreal Engine games. So what if we just take a look at the high settings with FSR quality? I have a feeling that's going to get us where we need to be. And there it is. Look, we're actually close to 90 FPS and all of that. So yeah, I really think that in most Unreal Engine 5 games, the Epic preset is kind of silly, and the high preset does a lot better on higher-end hardware, and lower-end hardware, medium settings, but on all hardware, Unreal Engine 5 really wants you to be upscaling. And that seems to be the case with this game. That kind of is most of my final thoughts on it. It really wants you to be upscaling. Don't try to max things out. It does seem to have a lot of VRAM usage as well, and we did see some stuttering that could have been shader compilation, could have been traversal stutter. But overall, it doesn't seem like completely disastrous, but is certainly demanding, although it seems like you can find playable settings on the various bits of hardware. We tested out stuff at least similar to their minimum recommended and Epic stuff. And it seems like their settings were overall not too far off, other than the Epic ones. Yeah, that seems a bit weird, how they're saying the 4K Epic preset, but it's not really 4K, and then you use upscaling. That seems a little bit off. But the rest of it didn't seem too off of giving you a 60-ish FPS there. Saw some CPU-limited stuff going on in the more heavy, you know, NPC-populated areas and all of that. So yeah, it's certainly not an easy-to-run game, for sure. But it seems like you can find settings to work on relatively modern hardware, just not necessarily maxing things out, and probably will be using upscaling. But yeah, I think that's all the time I have for today's video. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and have an excellent day.